The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. I am Daniel Foss, Communications Officer on the Relay Outpost Meridian Watch, sitting at the edge of human space, where our small fleet keeps quiet watch over trade lanes nobody important cares about. It was supposed to be a slow shift. I had a cup of cooling coffee, a half-finished report, and nothing on the long-range scanners except empty stars. Then the signal came in. It was not clean. It was not formatted the way proper distress calls are supposed to be, the way the Concord teaches every member species to send them, with codes and coordinates and calm voices reading from a script. This was raw. This was terror poured straight into a radio wave. A voice broke through the static, speaking in a language my translators struggled to keep up with. The words came out broken and pleading, cutting in and out, as if the speaker was moving while they spoke, as if they were afraid to stop moving. Anyone, please. Anyone who can hear this. We are dying. I sat up straight and pulled the signal onto the main screen. My hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed me, because I told myself I had heard distress calls before. Merchant ships with engine trouble. A mining colony that lost power during a storm. Nothing like this. The voice kept going. Attack ships. They came from the dark side of our second moon. No warning. Our defense grid is gone. They are burning the coast cities now. Behind the voice, I could hear something else. A deep groaning sound, like metal folding under pressure that should never be applied to it. Then screaming, distant but unmistakable. And then the signal cut out completely for 3 full seconds before it came back, weaker. This is Ethar Prime, the voice said. We are a peaceful world. We have no army. We have farmers and teachers and children. Please. Someone must be close enough to hear this. We do not care who you are. We do not care what you ask of us later. Just come. I looked at the star map on my secondary screen. Ethar Prime was a small agricultural world, 3rd planet in its system, home to a species called the Ethari. I had read about them once in a briefing packet nobody actually studies closely, the kind of report that gets filed and forgotten. Gentle people, traders, farmers, a species that had never built a single warship in their recorded history, because they had never needed one, tucked away in a quiet corner of the galaxy where nothing ever happened. Something was happening there now. I should have followed protocol. The manual sitting in the drawer beside my knee told me exactly what to do with an unverified distress call from a non-council world. Log it. Timestamp it. Forward it up the chain to Fleet Command, who would forward it to our observer liaison, who would submit it to the Concord Emergency Committee, who would schedule a session, who would eventually, maybe, vote on whether aid was appropriate, and if approved, whether it was proportional, and if proportional, whether it fit within the current allocation of peacekeeping resources for the quarter. That process, on a good day, took 11 days. I looked at the signal timestamp. The attack had started less than 40 minutes ago. My hand was already moving toward the priority channel before my brain fully decided to let it. Command, this is Meridian Watch. I have an active distress signal, non-council world, planet designation, Ethar Prime, populated, under attack right now. I say again, attack in progress. The response came back almost instantly, which told me something was already stirring somewhere far above my pay grade. A woman's voice, calm and clipped, cut through my speaker. Meridian Watch, this is Fleet Command. Patch the raw feed through immediately. Do not summarize. Do not filter. Send it as received. I sent it. I sat there listening to my own breathing while the feed uploaded, watching the connection bar crawl across the screen far too slowly for how fast my heart was beating. 30 seconds later, the voice on the other end returned, and it had changed. It was still calm, but underneath the calm, there was something sharper now, something that sounded almost like anger. Copy that signal, Meridian Watch. Stand by. I did not stand by quietly. I pulled up everything I could find on Ethar Prime while I waited. Population figures, basic geography, a handful of old trade agreements between their government and a scattering of merchant guilds. Nothing military, nothing that suggested this world had ever prepared for a single moment of conflict in its entire history. On the screen, the raw feed kept playing on a loop because I could not bring myself to close it. The voice that had first called out was still speaking, quieter now, as if the effort of shouting had worn them down. We sent this message to every frequency we know, they said. We do not know if anyone is listening. We have heard that some species answer these calls slowly, after long meetings, after long debates about whether we are worth the trouble. We understand if that is what happens to us too. We only wanted someone to know we tried to ask for help before the end. That last line sat in my chest like a stone. I have heard people say humans are impatient. I have heard people from a dozen other species describe us that way in meetings, in trade negotiations, in the small talk before a diplomatic session starts, always with a little smile like it is an amusing flaw, something to be tolerated. Humans do not wait well. Humans do not sit with a problem the way other species do. Humans want to fix things immediately, even when immediately is not realistic, even when immediately is not polite. Sitting there listening to a voice that had already accepted that no one was coming, I understood for the first time why that flaw might not be a flaw at all. 10 minutes passed. It felt like an hour. Then the priority channel opened again, and this time it was not Fleet Command. It was a voice I recognized, a voice that made my stomach tighten, because it belonged to someone far too senior to be personally contacting a small relay outpost like mine. "Foss," the voice said, "this is Captain Whitfield, 3rd Response Group. I need you to confirm something for me. Is that feed still live?" "It's on a loop, Captain. The last transmission we received. I don't know if the source is still transmitting." "Understood. Listen carefully. We are not waiting on this one. I need you to keep that channel open and keep recording everything, because we are moving, and I want a full account of what started this the moment we arrive." My throat went dry. "Moving, Captain? As in ships are already breaking orbit. As in I have a carrier group forming up behind me right now that is bigger than anything this outpost has ever seen pass through your sector. As in somebody screamed for help and we heard them, and we are done asking permission to go help people who are dying while we wait for a committee to schedule a meeting." I did not know what to say to that. I think I managed something like, "Understood, Captain," but I am honestly not sure the words came out in the right order. "One more thing, Foss," she said. "Forward that signal directly to every ship in the group. I want every crew member to hear that voice before we arrive. I want them to know exactly why we're going." "Yes, Captain." The channel closed. I sat there for a moment, in the sudden quiet of my small station, staring at the frozen image of the star map, at the tiny dot marked Ythar Prime, so far from anywhere that mattered to anyone but the people who lived there. Somewhere behind me, one of the junior techs, a young man named Peter Doyle who had only been posted to Meridian Watch for a few months, wandered over and looked at my screen. "What's going on?" he asked. "You look like you saw a ghost." "There's a world out past the edge of the trade lanes," I said. "Small, peaceful, no army, no defenses. Something attacked them about an hour ago. They sent out a distress call to anyone who might be listening. And Fleet Command is sending the standard response ship, a medical frigate, maybe an escort." I shook my head slowly, still trying to make sense of the words Captain Whitfield had used. Carrier group. Bigger than anything this outpost has ever seen. "No," I said. "I don't think they're sending a response ship at all. I think they're sending everything." Peter frowned. "Everything? That doesn't make sense. The Concord hasn't even reviewed the request yet. There hasn't been a vote. There isn't even an official classification for the threat. I don't think anyone's waiting for the Concord to catch up." He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Command is going to move an entire fleet to help a species we don't even have a formal alliance with, without permission, without a vote, without knowing what's even out there attacking them?" I thought about the voice on the recording. "We are a peaceful world. We have farmers and teachers and children." "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think that's exactly what's happening." Peter didn't respond right away. He looked at the screen, at the star map, at the small blinking dot that represented an entire world holding its breath. "That's insane," he finally said. I did not disagree with him. But some small part of me, the part that had listened to that voice break with exhaustion and fear and still ask, quietly, for someone to come, felt something else entirely, something that was not insane at all. It felt like pride. I forwarded the recording to every ship and 3rd Response Group, exactly as Captain Whitfield had ordered. And then, because I could not stop myself, I stayed at my station and watched the tracking display as, one by one, ship after ship, in our small corner of space, lit up with departure markers, engines flaring to life, course headings locking onto a tiny agricultural world that most of the galaxy had never even heard of. They were not sending a rescue shuttle. They were sending everything they had. And somewhere out there, a world that expected nothing but silence was about to learn exactly what it meant when a human being heard someone else crying for help. I did not sleep that night. None of us at Meridian Watch did. Word had spread through the outpost within an hour, the way it always does on a small station where everyone knows everyone else's business whether they want to or not. By the time my shift technically ended, half the crew had gathered in the common room, watching the same tracking display I had been staring at for hours, following the small cluster of departure markers as they grew and grew and grew. I want to explain what I was actually looking at, because the numbers alone do not carry the weight of what they meant. A single carrier group, in ordinary circumstances, is already a serious commitment of resources. It carries fighters, it carries Marines, it carries enough firepower to end most conflicts before they properly begin. Sending one carrier group anywhere is not a small decision. It requires fuel, personnel, authorization, and weeks of planning. Fleet Command sent 4. Then they kept adding to it. By the time I checked the display again after finally forcing myself to eat something, the marker cluster near Ethar Prime's projected position had grown to include supply ships, a full marine deployment fleet, 2 mobile medical stations large enough to treat thousands of patients at once, and something my scanner labeled only as Ascendant Dawn, a designation I did not recognize, moving at the front of the formation like the tip of a spear. Peter Doyle sat down next to me, with a tray of food he was not eating, staring at the same screen. "That's not a rescue mission anymore," he said. "That's an invasion force." "It's not invading anything," I said. "It's answering a call." "Daniel, look at the size of it. Nobody sends that much for a rescue. You send a frigate for a rescue. You send a hospital ship. This is..." He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "This is a message." I did not disagree with him. Exactly. But I did not think he had it quite right either. I did not think Fleet Command was trying to send a message to anyone. I think they were simply doing the math on how fast they could stop the dying, and the answer that math produced happened to look, from the outside, like an overwhelming show of force. That distinction mattered to me. I am not sure it mattered at all to the rest of the galaxy. Word of the deployment reached the Concord within hours, which should not have been possible through any official channel, since no formal aid request had been filed and no vote had taken place. I later learned that a junior aide on the Concord Emergency Committee had simply noticed the sudden flood of departure logs from human systems, all converging toward the same coordinates, and had raised the alarm out of pure confusion rather than any procedure. That confusion, it turned out, spread quickly. A diplomatic contact of ours, a soft-spoken alien liaison named Kessa Vren, from a species called the Alvedi, reached out to our station directly less than a day after the fleet departed. The Alvedi were an old species, careful and slow-moving in all their decisions, the kind of civilization that measured wisdom by how long they waited before acting. Kessa had worked with human representatives for several years, and had, in her own quiet way, become something close to a friend to several people at our outpost. Her message came through on a private channel, her voice tight with something I had never heard from her before. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to explain something to me, because what I am seeing does not make sense according to anything I understand about how aid requests are processed." "I'll try," I said. "There is no formal Concord authorization for what your fleet is doing. There has been no emergency session called. No vote has taken place regarding intervention on Ethar Prime. And yet human ships, in numbers I have never seen assembled this quickly in my lifetime, are already 3/4 of the way to that system." "That's correct," I said. "How is that possible? Even for humans, this seems extreme. What if the threat at Ethar Prime is larger than anyone realizes? What if this is a trap, or a provocation from a hostile power testing your response? You are committing resources on this scale, based on a single unverified distress call." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Kessa, someone was screaming for help. We heard it. That was enough." There was a long pause on the line. "That is not how any of the rest of us operate," she finally said. "We would have verified the threat. We would have consulted our allies. We would have debated the proportional response. Even species far more aggressive than my own would not commit a force of this size without weeks of preparation." "I know," I said. I don't think that's how we're built. It frightens people, Daniel. I want you to understand that. Several delegations are already asking whether this is truly about the Ithari at all, or whether it is a demonstration meant for the rest of us, a way of showing what human forces are capable of mobilizing without warning. That comment stayed with me long after the call ended, because it was the first time I understood that the story unfolding above Ithar Prime was not only about the people being rescued, it was also, whether we intended it or not, a story about us. I pulled up what fragments of information I could find on the actual attacking force, trying to understand what our fleet was flying into. The Ithari had no formal military records to consult, no intelligence network of their own to draw from. What little we knew came from scattered trade reports and second-hand accounts from merchant convoys that had passed near the system in recent months. The attackers called themselves the Skarn. They were not a nation in any formal sense, more a loose confederation of raiding fleets that drifted between poorly defended systems, taking resources, taking captives, moving on, before any organized response could gather against them. They had struck at least 6 other minor worlds in the past several years, always the same pattern: overwhelm the target quickly, strip what could be taken, vanish before help arrived. They had never faced anything like what was now approaching. I do not say that with pride exactly. I say it because it was true, and because the scale of what was coming for them was, by any honest measure, far beyond what their crime demanded in a strict sense of proportional justice. But proportional justice was not what Fleet Command was pursuing. They were pursuing an end to the dying, as fast as physically possible, and if that meant arriving with more force than the situation technically required, that was a cost they were willing to accept without hesitation. On the ground at Ithar Prime, according to fragments of transmission we continued to intercept, the situation had grown steadily worse in the hours after the initial distress call. Coastal cities had fallen silent one after another. Reports described entire districts stripped of supplies, of families separated, of a population that had never needed a defense force now discovering, in the worst possible way, what it meant to have none. I listened to another recording that came through late that second night, a different voice this time, older, steadier, though no less afraid. "They have taken the northern settlements," the voice said. "We do not know how many have survived. Our elders are trying to organize what shelter we can, but we have no way to fight back. We are farmers. We build things. We have never needed to learn how to defend what we build." Then, after a pause, we heard, through channels we do not fully understand, that a human fleet may be coming. We do not know if this is true, or if it is simply a rumor born from desperation. If it is true, we do not know what to expect. "We have heard stories about your people. Some say you are reckless. Some say you move too fast, decide too quickly, care too little for careful process. If those stories are true, then perhaps, for once, that is exactly what we need." I sat with that thought for a long time. The tracking display in front of me showed the fleet closing the final distance to the Ithar system, still hours away, but no longer the abstract cluster of departure markers it had been the day before. It was real now. It was close. Kessa Vren contacted me one more time before the fleet arrived, her voice quieter than before, almost thoughtful. "I have been considering what you told me," she said, "about hearing someone scream for help and that being enough. And? I do not know if it is wisdom or recklessness. Perhaps, in this instance, it does not matter which. I only hope, for the sake of the people waiting on that world, that your fleet arrives before there is nothing left to save. I hoped for the same thing, more than I had hoped for anything in a long time." Somewhere ahead of us, in the dark between stars, 4 carrier groups, and everything that traveled with them, cut through the emptiness, at speeds that strained every engine to its limit, racing against a clock none of us could see, but all of us could feel, carrying help to a world that had expected, at best, a single ship, and instead was about to witness the full and undivided attention of an entire civilization that had decided, without a vote, without a committee, without a single moment of hesitation, that watching people die while paperwork moved through proper channels was simply not something we were capable of doing. Captain Whitfield had arranged for a live feed to be shared with every station under Fleet Command's authority the moment the lead ships reached Ithar Prime, and I sat at my console at Meridian Watch with the rest of my shift crowded behind me, watching in near silence as the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above the besieged world. I have tried many times since then to describe what that felt like, watching it happen on a screen from so far away, and I have never found words that feel adequate. The sensor feed painted the arrival in simple geometric shapes at first, dots and lines representing hulls and formations, but even reduced to that cold technical language, the sheer number of them was staggering. Ship after ship after ship, unfolding out of the dark, in perfect coordinated waves, more arriving every few seconds, until the display had to zoom out twice, just to keep the entire formation visible on one screen. On the ground, according to the accounts gathered afterward, the experience was something else entirely. A Yathari elder named Doran Vesh, one of the survivors I later had the honor of speaking with directly, described standing outside a half-collapsed shelter with dozens of others, staring up at a sky that had been full of smoke and fire for 2 days straight. He told me the smoke had thinned just enough, for one brief moment, to reveal the stars. And then the stars themselves seemed to change, he said, as though the sky had grown a second layer of light, and that layer was moving, and it did not stop moving, and it did not stop growing. He said no one around him spoke for almost a full minute. They simply stood and watched, unsure whether what they were seeing was salvation or a new and larger threat come to finish what the first one had started. Above the planet, the Skarn raiding fleet had spent the previous 2 days operating with total confidence. They had faced no meaningful resistance since their first strike. Their ships moved freely through Ethar Prime's orbital space, directing strikes against the surface, and coordinating ground teams that continued to strip whatever they could carry from the settlements they had already broken. I obtained, much later, portions of the intercepted communications between Skarn vessels in the moments after our fleet arrived. I share them here not to dwell on anyone's fear, but because I believe they capture, better than anything I could describe myself, exactly how unprepared the raiders were for what came next. The first voice, tight with confusion, simply said, "Report that contact. What is that formation?" A second voice, higher, faster. "That is not a response ship. That is not even close to a response ship. I am reading hundreds of separate hull signatures. This cannot be accurate. Recalibrate the sensors." Sensors are calibrated. Confirm the count again. A long pause. The count is accurate. There was no meaningful reply to that for several seconds. Then the first voice again. Quieter now. This was one distress call. One planet with no defenses. Why would anyone send this much for one distress call? I do not know how to answer that question any better now than I did then, except to say that I do not think the size of the response was ever meant to match the size of the threat. I think it was only ever meant to match the size of the need, and there is a difference between those two things that the Skarn, and much of the wider galaxy, had simply never encountered before. What followed happened quickly, faster than most engagements of that scale are recorded to unfold. Captain Whitfield's own account, given later during the formal debrief, described the tactical approach in plain terms. "We did not open with caution," she said. "We did not open with warning shots or diplomatic broadcasts, asking them to stand down and discuss terms. There were still people dying on that surface while we deliberated over how politely to phrase a warning, so we did not deliberate. We moved to end the threat as quickly as the situation allowed, and we accepted that ending it quickly would look, to outside observers, less careful than they were used to seeing." The engagement itself, from what I understand of the tactical logs, unfolded across 3 distinct phases. In the first phase, human fighter wings launched from the carriers before the larger vessels had even finished settling into formation, moving to establish control of the orbital space directly above the worst affected settlements. This was not, I want to be clear, primarily a combat maneuver. It was a rescue maneuver, disguised as one, because establishing that control immediately allowed the medical and evacuation ships trailing behind the fighters to begin their descent to the surface without delay. In the second phase, the larger carriers and escort vessels moved to directly confront the main body of the Skarn raiding fleet, which had begun attempting to regroup and retreat once the scale of the arriving force became clear. Several raiding vessels attempted to break away entirely, calculating, correctly, that continued engagement offered no realistic outcome in their favor. Very few of them succeeded in escaping. I want to be careful here, because I do not wish to describe this part of the story with more detail than serves any purpose beyond honesty. The engagement was decisive, it was fast. It ended the immediate threat to the surface within a span of time that, according to the official record, was shorter than many single training exercises conducted by other species during peacetime drills. Whatever losses occurred on both sides, and I do not believe either side involved found any of it something worth celebrating in the way old stories sometimes celebrate battles. It was simply what needed to happen for the third phase to begin. The third phase was the one that mattered most, to me and to everyone who lived through it on the ground. While the last scattered elements of the Skarn fleet were still being contained, dropships were already descending through the cleared airspace toward every major settlement that had reported activity. These were not purely rescue vessels. Each one carried a mixed team, medical personnel working alongside engineers, alongside security teams, whose primary task was simply to stand as a visible, steady presence for a population that had spent 2 days believing no one was coming. Doran Vesh described the moment the first dropship landed near his shelter, with more clarity than almost anything else he shared with me. "We did not know what to do," he said. "We had prepared ourselves, in the quiet hours before, for the possibility that whatever was coming might simply be a larger and more thorough version of what had already happened to us. Some of the younger ones wanted to run. I told them to wait, because running had not saved anyone in 2 days, and perhaps waiting, just once, might." He described the ramp of the dropship lowering, and the first figures to step out being not soldiers with weapons raised, but 2 people in medical gear, moving quickly toward the nearest group of injured, kneeling beside them, before a single word had been exchanged between any of the parties present. "They did not ask permission," he said. "They did not wait for an introduction, or a translator, or a formal greeting between representatives of our peoples. They simply began helping the people closest to them, as though that was the only thing that mattered in that moment, and every other question could wait." I think that detail, more than the size of the fleet, more than the speed of the engagement, is the part of this story that I find myself returning to most often. I was not present on the surface myself. My role throughout all of this remained back at Meridian Watch, monitoring feeds and forwarding communications, a small and distant piece of a much larger effort. But I did have the chance, weeks later, to speak by recorded message with a young medic named Grace Sutton, who had been among the first wave to reach the surface that day, and her account has stayed with me since. She described finding a group of children sheltering in the remains of a storage building near one of the northern settlements, separated from their families during the chaos of the initial attack, frightened and unsure whether the approaching figures in unfamiliar uniforms represented safety or a new danger. There was one girl, Grace told me, who could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, by whatever measure translates closest to human age for her species. She was holding onto a younger sibling so tightly her hands had gone pale. She did not speak our language, and I did not speak hers, and the translator equipment in my kit had been damaged during the descent. Grace said she did not try to speak at all. She simply knelt down slowly, keeping her movements calm and unhurried, and held out a ration bar from her kit, waiting without pressing forward, letting the choice belong entirely to the child in front of her. She looked at it for a long moment, Grace said, long enough that I started to wonder if I had made the wrong choice, if I had frightened her further by getting too close. And then she reached out and took it, and she looked up at me, and I will never forget the way her expression changed, from fear to something closer to disbelief, as though she could not quite understand why a stranger who did not know her language or her name would kneel down in the middle of a ruined street just to make sure she had something to eat. Grace told me she stayed with that group of children until a proper evacuation team arrived to reunite them with surviving family members, hours later. She said she did not think of it as a remarkable act at the time. She said it simply felt like the only thing worth doing in that moment, and that most of the medics and engineers who had descended with her that day would likely say the same thing about whatever small task occupied their own hands. I think that is, in the end, the truest description of what happened at Ethar Prime that I have ever heard. It was not one grand act of heroism performed by a single fleet commander or a single decisive battle. It was thousands of small acts performed simultaneously by ordinary people who had been given the resources and the permission to act immediately, without waiting for a committee to confirm that acting immediately was the correct and proportional response. By the time the sun set over the settlements that had been under attack only hours earlier, the skies above Ethar Prime had changed completely. Where there had been raiding vessels stripping the world of everything it had, there were now supply convoys descending in orderly formation, engineers already assessing damaged structures, medical stations set up in open fields with lines of patients being seen faster than anyone on the ground had believed possible. Doran Vesh told me that as the last light faded that evening, he stood outside the field hospital that had been raised near his settlement and watched human engineers working by portable floodlight to restore power to what remained of a water treatment facility that had been damaged during the attack. They did not have to do that so quickly, he said. The immediate danger had passed. They could have rested. Instead, they worked through the night because they had determined, apparently without any single person ordering them to, that clean water mattered as much as anything else that had happened that day. I asked him what he had thought, standing there watching that. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. I thought, he said, that perhaps we had been wrong about many things we believed we understood about the wider galaxy. I thought that help, real help, does not always arrive slowly and carefully, weighed and measured and debated, until it is almost too late to matter. Sometimes it arrives all at once, faster than anyone expects, larger than anyone thought necessary, and asks for nothing in return, except that you take the ration bar being offered, and let someone hold your hand while the ground beneath you finally stops shaking. News of what had happened at Ethar Prime reached the rest of the galaxy long before any official report was filed, the way important news always seems to travel faster than the systems meant to manage it. By the third day, every station within range of the trade lanes had heard some version of the story, though the versions differed wildly depending on who was telling them. At Meridian Watch, we received a steady stream of inquiries from other outposts, other species, other diplomatic channels, all asking some version of the same question. Was it true? Had humans really sent that much, that fast, without a single vote or authorization from the Concord? I answered as many of those inquiries as I could, though after a while, Captain Whitfield asked that all formal responses be routed through her office instead, since my answers, however honest, were not exactly diplomatic in tone. The Concord Emergency Committee finally convened 3 full days after the fleet had already ended the crisis and begun the work of rebuilding. I was permitted to watch a recording of that session afterward, and I found myself both amused and quietly frustrated by what I saw. Representatives from a dozen member species spent the better part of an hour debating the proper procedure for retroactively classifying an intervention that had already concluded. Several delegates raised concerns about precedent, about what it might mean for the future if a single species could commit overwhelming force to a conflict without prior authorization, regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. A delegate from a species called the Torvain, whose civilization prided itself on measured and careful diplomacy above almost everything else, spoke at length about the danger of celebrating an outcome achieved through a process that bypassed every safeguard the Concord had built over centuries, specifically to prevent unilateral military action between member worlds. We are not questioning whether lives were saved, the Torvain delegate said. We are questioning what it means that lives were saved this way, by a single species acting entirely on its own judgment, with a force large enough that had they encountered resistance from another established power, rather than a loose raiding fleet, the consequences could have been far more serious than anyone currently discusses. I understood the concern, even as I disagreed with the weight being placed on it. It was true that the human fleet had acted without waiting for anyone's approval. It was true that the scale of the response had, by any reasonable measure, gone well beyond what the immediate threat required. But sitting in that recorded session, listening to careful, measured voices debate the theoretical dangers of speed and generosity, I could not stop thinking about a voice on a distress call that had, only days earlier, quietly accepted that no help was coming at all. Kessa Vren spoke during that same session, and her words were the ones I found myself replaying most often afterward. I understand the concerns raised by my esteemed colleagues, she said. I share some of them myself. But I would ask this committee to remember something important. While we debate the theoretical risks of an unauthorized response, the population of Ethar Prime is, at this very moment, receiving medical care, structural repairs, and food supplies from the very fleet whose actions we are questioning. Had we followed our own established procedures exactly as written, that population would still be waiting for our first vote to conclude. There was a long silence in the recording after she said that. No one offered a direct response. The session ended, eventually, with a formal motion to open a broader review of emergency response protocols across the Concord, a process that everyone in that room surely understood would take months, possibly years, to conclude. I do not know, even now, whether anything meaningful ever came of that review. I know only that while it continued, human relief efforts on Ethar Prime continued alongside it, unaffected by the pace of the conversation happening so far above the people actually receiving the help. The Athari themselves, meanwhile, were beginning to process what had happened to them in ways that went beyond simple gratitude. I received, through Kessa's continued correspondence, several translated accounts from Yathari community leaders describing the mixture of emotions that had settled over their world in the weeks following the attack. Relief was there, certainly, and gratitude, expressed in ways both formal and deeply personal. But there was also something more complicated sitting alongside those feelings, something Doran Vesh had touched on when I spoke with him directly. We are grateful beyond what words can properly express, he told me. But I would be dishonest if I said we were not also afraid, in a new and different way than we were afraid during the attack itself. I asked him to explain what he meant. Before the attack, he said, we understood our place in the galaxy clearly. We were a small world, without power, without the ability to defend ourselves, relying entirely on the restraint and goodwill of larger powers around us. That was a frightening way to exist, but it was a familiar fear, one we had carried for generations. He paused before continuing. Now we understand something new. We understand that a species exists, out among the stars, capable of assembling and deploying overwhelming force, within hours of hearing a single distress call, without waiting for permission from anyone. We are grateful that this force was used to save us. But we cannot help wondering what it would mean if such force were ever turned toward a different purpose. We have seen what humans can do when they decide to help. We find ourselves wondering, quietly, what it might look like if they ever decided differently. I did not have a comfortable answer for him. I still do not have one, if I am honest. I can only say what I believe to be true, which is that the decision to help had never, at any point in the process I witnessed, been treated as a demonstration of anything beyond the simple fact that people were in danger and needed to be reached quickly. But I understood, listening to Doran, that intention and perception do not always align, and that the rest of the galaxy would likely spend a long time deciding for itself what this event truly meant, regardless of what any single person on the responding side had intended. That tension, gratitude tangled together with a new and unfamiliar wariness, seemed to spread well beyond Ethar Prime itself in the weeks that followed. Several smaller species with no formal defense capability of their own began quietly reaching out to human diplomatic channels, asking questions about the nature of our response protocols, about what circumstances might qualify a world for similar assistance in the future. At the same time, several larger and more established powers grew noticeably more cautious in their communications with human representatives. I noted, reading through diplomatic summaries that crossed my station in those weeks, a subtle shift in tone from several delegations that had previously treated humanity as a curious but ultimately minor presence within the wider Concord. That tone had changed to something more careful, more measured, the tone one uses when reassessing the true size and capability of a neighbor one had previously underestimated. Captain Whitfield addressed this shift directly during a briefing I was permitted to attend by remote link, several weeks after the Ethar Prime engagement had concluded. I want to be clear about something, she said to the assembled officers. We did not go to Ethar Prime to send a message to anyone. We went because people were dying, and we had the ability to stop it. If other powers within the Concord have drawn conclusions about our capabilities from watching how quickly we responded, that is a consequence of our actions, not the purpose behind them. She paused, glancing around the room before continuing. That said, I would ask every one of you to understand that the galaxy will remember this. They will remember how fast we moved and how much we were willing to commit, and they will factor that into every future interaction they have with us, whether we intend for them to or not. I do not think that is something we should regret. I think it is simply something we should understand clearly, so that we carry the weight of it honestly going forward. I thought about her words often in the months that followed, particularly as reports continued to arrive describing the slow, steady recovery taking shape on Ythar Prime. Settlements that had been stripped bare were rebuilt, in many cases with improvements the original structures had never possessed. Medical stations that had been raised as temporary emergency shelters gradually transitioned into permanent facilities, staffed jointly by Ythari trainees and the human medical teams who had chosen, many of them voluntarily, to remain behind, well past the point their official deployment required. Grace Sutton was among those who stayed. I received occasional messages from her throughout that period, describing the slow work of training local medical staff, of watching children who had once flinched at the sound of an approaching engine gradually learn to run toward the supply convoys instead, recognizing them now as something other than a threat. "It is strange," she wrote to me in one message, "how quickly fear can be replaced, when the thing that replaces it proves itself again and again, in small ways, day after day. I do not think the people here will ever forget what happened to them. But I also do not think they will ever forget what came after, and I believe, given enough time, the second memory may end up mattering more than the first." I hope she was right. I still hope that, even now, as I put these events into words for anyone who might one day wish to understand exactly what happened, and exactly what it revealed, about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable nature of the species I am proud, and occasionally afraid, to belong to. 6 months after the events at Ythar Prime, I received an unusual request through official channels, one that took me several minutes of staring at the message before I fully understood what was being asked of me. The Concord had scheduled a formal session to reconsider humanity's standing within the wider governing body, moving from observer status toward full membership, a process that had been quietly stalled for years due to lingering uncertainty about human reliability and temperament. As part of that session, testimony had been requested from individuals directly involved in the response to Ythar Prime, and my name, apparently, had been included on the list, owing to my position as the first person to receive and forward the original distress call. I was not asked to travel in person. The session would be conducted primarily through recorded and live remote testimony, gathered from witnesses scattered across dozens of worlds and stations. Still, the weight of the request settled on me heavily in the days before I was scheduled to speak. Captain Whitfield contacted me the evening before the session, her tone lighter than I usually heard from her, though there was something serious underneath it as well. "Nervous, Foss?" she asked. "A little, Captain." "Good, means you understand what's actually happening here. Just tell them what you told me that first night. Tell them the truth. That's all anyone's asking for." I thought about that advice for a long time before the session began. The recorded proceedings I later reviewed showed that the Concord session opened not with human testimony, but with a delegation from Ythar Prime itself, the first formal appearance of Ythari representatives before the full governing body since their world had joined as an observer species years earlier. Largely ignored, much as humanity had been. Doran Vesh stood among that delegation, and I confess I felt a small, quiet swell of pride watching him speak before an assembly of species far more powerful and established than his own had ever been treated as an equal to. "I was asked to describe what happened on my world," he told the assembled representatives, "and I have struggled, in the months since, to find language adequate to the task. I can tell you the facts plainly enough. We were attacked without warning. We had no means to defend ourselves. We sent a distress call to anyone who might hear it, expecting, if we are honest, very little in return." He paused, and even through the recording, I could sense the room holding its attention completely still. "What we received instead was not a token gesture," he continued. "It was not a single ship sent to acknowledge our suffering, while more important matters were debated elsewhere. It was the full and immediate attention of an entire civilization, arriving faster than we believed possible, staying longer than any obligation required, asking for nothing in return, beyond the simple fact that we were people who needed help." He looked around the chamber slowly before continuing. "I understand that some among this assembly view what happened with caution, even concern. I understand the argument that a single species should not be able to commit such overwhelming force without the approval of this body. I do not dismiss that concern entirely. But I would ask each of you to consider this. On the day my world burned, we did not need caution. We did not need careful deliberation about proportional response. We needed someone to come, And one civilization among all of you was the only one willing to come immediately, without asking what it would cost them to do so. He concluded his remarks with a simple request, formally proposed on behalf of his people, urging the Concord to grant humanity full membership status without further delay, describing it as, in his own words, a debt his world could never fully repay, but wished, at minimum, to formally acknowledge. My own testimony followed later in the session, delivered live from Meridian Watch, and I will admit I do not remember every word I said with perfect clarity. I remember describing the moment the distress signal first came through, the panic in that first voice, the way it had already begun to accept that no help was coming, before I had even finished forwarding it to command. I remember describing Captain Whitfield's response, and the strange mixture of pride and disbelief I had felt watching an entire fleet mobilize within hours, driven by nothing more official than the simple, unshakable conviction that people in danger deserve to be reached as quickly as humanly possible. One delegate, from a species I did not recognize immediately, asked me a question near the end of my testimony that I have thought about often since. "Do you believe," they asked, "that your species would respond the same way regardless of who was calling for help? Regardless of whether the world in danger held any strategic or material value to your people?" I answered honestly, because I could not think of any other way to answer. "I believe we would," I said, "not because we are especially noble or especially wise. I think, if anything, it is closer to the opposite. I think we are simply not very good at waiting, once we understand that someone is suffering and we have the ability to stop it. I do not think that impulse checks itself against strategic value before it acts. I have seen no evidence that it does." The delegate did not respond further, though I noted, watching the recording later, a slow and thoughtful nod from several other representatives seated nearby. The formal vote on human membership took place 3 weeks after that session concluded. I learned the result the same way most people did, through a brief official announcement that carried far less weight in its wording than the moment itself deserved. Humanity had been granted full membership within the Concord, effective immediately, with several delegations, including the Torvain, formally recording their continued reservations, even as they voted in favor. Kessa Vren contacted me privately not long after the announcement, her voice carrying a warmth I had not heard from her before. "I wanted to speak with you directly," she said, "rather than simply send a formal message. I have known your people for several years now, Daniel, and I confess I did not always understand you. I found your impatience frustrating, your willingness to act before fully deliberating a situation troubling, even reckless at times. And now?" I asked. "Now I find myself grateful for exactly the qualities that once troubled me most. I do not think the galaxy has fully decided what to make of your species yet. I think many will spend a long time weighing gratitude against caution when they consider what humans are capable of, in either direction. But I no longer count myself among those who see your speed and your generosity as a flaw to be managed. I have come to see it, instead, as something the rest of us might learn from, even if we can never quite replicate it ourselves." I did not know how to respond to that beyond a simple thank you, which felt inadequate to the moment but was, in the end, the truest thing I had to offer. Not long after that conversation, I received a small parcel through official diplomatic channels, sent from Ythar Prime directly to my station. Inside was a handwritten letter, translated carefully into our language alongside the original script, along with a small woven object crafted from local materials, a symbol, the letter explained, traditionally given among the Ithari as a mark of lasting gratitude between families, rarely extended beyond their own people. The letter was written by Doran Vesh. "I do not know if you will ever fully understand what your actions meant to my people," he wrote, "but I wished for you, specifically, to know that the first voice heard on your side of that terrible night belonged to someone who chose to act rather than wait, and that choice saved more lives than any of us will ever be able to properly count. I hope you carry that knowledge with you, not as a burden, but as something closer to an honor, because that is exactly how my people intend it. I kept that letter, and I keep the small woven object it arrived alongside, on the shelf above my station console, where I see it every time I sit down for a shift. I do not know what the future holds for humanity within the wider galactic community we have only recently, and somewhat reluctantly, been fully welcomed into. I know that some worlds now watch us with quiet caution, wondering what it might mean, in some future circumstance, if the force we showed at Ethar Prime were ever turned toward a purpose less generous than the one that first inspired it. I cannot promise anyone, human or otherwise, that such a moment will never come. I can only say what I witnessed with my own eyes during those strange, overwhelming days, which is that when the moment arrived, when a small and defenseless world screamed into the dark with no real expectation that anyone would answer, an entire civilization chose, without hesitation, without a vote, without waiting to calculate what the act might cost them politically or otherwise, to answer that scream as loudly and as completely as it possibly could. They thought, if they thought of us at all before that day, that humans might send some measure of aid, delivered slowly, carefully, after due consideration. They did not expect an entire armada, arriving before the sun had even set on the first day of their suffering, carrying not only the means to end the immediate danger, but the quiet, stubborn determination to stay long afterward, rebuilding what had been broken, one small act of kindness at a time. I do not know what the rest of the galaxy will ultimately decide to call that impulse. Recklessness, perhaps, by some measures. Generosity beyond reasonable limit, by others. I have stopped trying to find the single correct word for it myself. I only know that when I close my eyes and remember that first terrified voice breaking through the static on an otherwise quiet shift, and then remember, months later, a letter written by hand from a world that had learned, in the space of a single unbearable day, exactly what it meant to be answered, I find that I would not trade that impulse for anything the rest of the galaxy might consider wiser, or safer, or more carefully measured in its place. We heard someone crying for help. We came anyway, faster and larger than anyone thought sensible, and I have never once, in all the months since, heard a single person who was there that day describe it as a mistake.